All right, I'll get started. So just as the introduction said, basically, I'm the business development manager at NOCRI. And one thing you probably need to learn about the NHS, first of all, is there are a lot of acronyms within the NHS. The first one for today is NOCRI, which is the NIHR, Office for Clinical Research Infrastructure. And for those of you that might not know about NIHR, it's the National Institute for Health Research in the UK. So it's broadly seen as the research arm or clinical research arm of the NHS in the UK. So really, what I want to go through today is an overview of NIHR, a brief overview. I can't do justice to NIHR in 15 minutes or whatever, but I'll give you a brief overview and then focus on probably 2 or 3 bits which I think would be of interest to you. And obviously, I'm happy to take questions and meet up afterwards to discuss in a bit more detail. So really, looking at the NIHR infrastructure, I mean, don't be afraid of this. It's not, it is a huge beast, but in terms of how to access this, and I'll come to that a bit later on, all you need to understand is that there are different parts to the National Institute for Health Research. It's not an organization, it's a virtual organization. It's not like a building where you go and see people. It's made up of universities, NHS trusts, hospitals, and different bodies within that. So the first one that I want to just highlight is the biomedical research centers. These are universities and NHS trusts working together to fulfill what's called the early phase clinical research side of things. So in the pharma speak, in the pharmaceutical side of things, this is very much sort of preclinical phase 1, phase 2, 2A studies. But really from the medical devices technologies point of view, this is more of proof of concept, early development of technologies and so on. The biomedical research centers span all disease areas. Yeah, so there isn't a specific disease area, but they span all disease areas. Moving on to the next one, the biomedical research units. These are specific units within the NHS trusts that have an area of focus. So, for example, there are biomedical research units that focus on respiratory disease. There are those that focus on cardiovascular disease, musculoskeletal disease, and so on. And these are spread across England. And then clinical research facilities, just basically what it says on the tin is facilities where these are manned by nurses, clinical research nurses, clinicians, investigators, where patients are brought in to carry out tests, research, and so on. We also have experimental cancer medicine centers, the ECMC is another acronym. These are co-funded between Cancer Research UK and NIHR. And these, as it says, there's a focus on cancer, and there's 13 of these across the UK. The 2 I really want to focus on today are the healthcare technology cooperatives and the diagnostic evidence cooperatives. And there's a couple more slides on these, so I won't say too much on these. But say, for example, that you have a technology which, it's developed, CE marked, you've got some proof of concept data, everything is in place, but what you want to do is run some major clinical trials. Some maybe larger trials. Where do you go? We've got something called the NIHR Clinical Research Network, a very well-established system whereby industry can access through one portal and they can submit information, whether it's synopsis, protocols, and so on. And again, I've got a few slides. But the idea really is to make it easier for industry to submit their studies through this one portal. And I would say that in terms of if you know exactly what you want to do, the clinical research network is where you want to go to carry out any clinical research. And then later on, when we're looking at more of the evaluation and adoption of technology, we've got something called the CLARCs, another acronym. These are the Collaborations for Leadership in Applied Health Research and Care. These are very much looking at implementation of technologies and how the implementation changes management of patients within the healthcare system. So very much at a ground level, very much at where the GPs, where the clinicians work. So all this invention, evaluation, adoption piece, it seems straightforward. Maybe not as straightforward when you come in from outside, but it is straightforward when you're talking to clinicians, because ultimately the clinicians that are working in the early phase in the biomedical research centers are also the ones that are looking after patients later on. So what I would say to you is that think of it this way. How do you create, or how do you link up to a key opinion leader or clinician at an early stage for them to become your advocate for your technology? Yeah, it's about them getting a hands-on technology at an early stage, so they can help you either develop it or at least do the evaluations early on or clinical research early on. So all this, and like it was said earlier, all this is backed by government funding from Department of Health, and it's not a small piece of infrastructure. We've got £500 million that goes into this infrastructure, and the money is there to keep the staff going, so research nurses, clinicians, the facilities. And if you were to walk into some of these clinical research facilities and biomedical research units, you'd see exactly what's gone into these units. So there's a lot of state-of-the-art equipment that goes in, so people can actually go in and carry out some of their research. So really, the idea with this whole setup is to look at technologies at an early stage. The last thing we want to do is to get technologies coming in after having CE mark, having 2 years on the market, and saying actually we haven't got access to patients. So we want to be able to tell you actually at an early stage, when you're either developing your technology at a proof of concept stage, say for example, working with clinicians to say, actually, this technology really fits into this group of patients, and it can help patients or help manage patients in this way. So have those early decisions about the technology. So early go, no-go decisions, that's what we call it. And it's important for industry and companies that they have that decision early on, because what you don't want to do is be 2 years down the line and suddenly thinking, actually, this is not the right group of patients. Yeah. So have those decisions early on. And this is, again, linking up with investigators and clinicians at an early stage. Okay, so what do we do in terms of looking at the whole sort of overall picture? So what we're trying to do is look at appropriate biomarkers, stratification potentially of patients using technology, and also looking at disease endpoints. But at the same time, what we are trying to do, and we are managing this to a certain extent, is really shorten timelines. Because we understand that it takes time for technologies to be developed, but at the same time, for things like medical devices, diagnostics, things move on. Innovation moves on at such a rapid pace that you don't want to be spending 3-4 years just trying to evaluate something. So we want to try and shorten timelines, and also this will aid in better decision making. But at the same time, what we want to do is deliver to time, budget, and also quality. And quality is key. And is central to NIHR and the clinical research that takes place within that. So I mentioned a couple of bits of infrastructure that I want to focus on. Firstly is the NIHR healthcare technology cooperatives. The focus of these is medical devices and medical technologies. And really, the idea with this is that we see a lot of technologies sitting in the bench space, technologies which are really innovative, but they don't get pulled into the clinical space. So the healthcare technology cooperatives are looking for those technologies and actually saying, we can see where that technology fits in this clinical space. And they want to pull those technologies through and help industry. And the key remit here for them is to work with industry to pull those technologies into the NHS, into the clinical arena. And the idea, again, is to work not just with industry, but with patients, charities, and academia, to make sure that things are happening in the right way, technologies are being developed in the right way, and we are then focusing on patients and patient outcomes. So within England and the healthcare technology cooperatives, there are 8 that have been set up and funded, and there are some specific areas of focus with these healthcare technology cooperatives. So I'll go through these just in turn and just as an overview. So Leeds has an HTC around colorectal therapies. Bradford is wound care. Sheffield is devices for dignity. They focus on renal incontinence and assistive mobility technologies. Birmingham has a big trauma unit, and it's probably the biggest trauma unit in Europe, and they have a focus on medical devices around trauma and trauma management. Nottingham has something called MindTech. They work on technologies around neurodevelopment disorders and mental health. Cambridge is a big unit there around traumatic brain injury, so there's a focus there. Barts and Royal London is gastrointestinal disease, and Guy's and St Thomas's is cardiovascular disease. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, okay, those are 8 areas that my technology does not fit in any of those. that doesn't mean to say that's all we focus on. So remember when I mentioned the biomedical research units and the biomedical research centers, we have those centers also working on medical devices and technologies. So it's not that if you don't see anything that fits in your arena here at the healthcare technology cooperatives that we don't work on with you, but we will. We will find other centers that will be able to work with you on your technology. So the other bit, that was medical devices, anything from point of care, imaging, and so on. So the other bit of the infrastructure we have is the NIHR Diagnostic Evidence Cooperatives. This is where in vitro diagnostics, so blood tests, urine tests, tissue samples, all that kind of stuff. So when you've got technologies that are focusing on those sort of areas, we've set up these diagnostic evidence cooperatives to look and help companies bring those technologies into the clinical space again. But the idea with the diagnostic evidence cooperatives, and it really stems from some of the asks from industry when we were talking to industry about 3-4 years ago, is that they didn't really see how they could get proper evidence for their technologies to then be brought into the NHS. So here the diagnostic evidence cooperatives are working on developing or helping companies develop the clinical validity, clinical utility, cost effectiveness argument for the technologies, and really work with industry, work with companies, because the idea here again is work with industry, work with commercially available IVDs, and bring these into the clinical space. And I know Nick is here from NICE, and he'll probably talk about this, so I don't want to steal his thunder. But all I want to say on this is that the diagnostic evidence cooperatives are linked very, very well now with the sort of the pathway and looking at how technologies will move from sort of the clinical evaluation space into the NICE diagnostic assessment program. And again, one of the areas that the diagnostic evidence cooperatives are focusing on is around methodologies around evaluations of IVDs. And it's very important because there's been a gap, I suppose, in terms of the clinical evaluations around IVD evaluations. And this is where we're hoping that we can plug that gap with the diagnostic evidence cooperatives. So where are these located? The DECs, we call them, Leeds, Newcastle, Oxford, and Imperial. All four of these centres are working together collaboratively around the methodologies, but they also have some areas of unique sort of specialisms. So Leeds, for example, liver disease, musculoskeletal, renal. Newcastle has cancer, cardiovascular, stroke, genetics, musculoskeletal. Oxford is focusing very much on primary care and IVDs that will impact management of patients in primary care. And Imperial College is focusing on point-of-care devices, so in vitro diagnostics on point-of-care devices. We've seen a big influx of technologies around molecular diagnostics. And so what we're looking at now is how can these DECs really help companies bring those molecular diagnostic technologies into the clinical space and evaluate those technologies. So that's sort of the infrastructure. But what I also wanted to just quickly touch on is something that we've developed over the last 6 to 8 months is something called the development pathway. And this has been developed primarily for the in vitro diagnostics, but we see this working very similar to the medical devices. And I apologize, it might be a bit small, but just to give you a flavor of this, is that what we're looking at is, a lot of companies work in the invention space, and they move from invention space thinking, okay, yeah, we've got our CE mark, because that's what they work on, that's the model that they really work on. And they move into the adoption phase. And they miss this big chunk of the evaluation bit, which is where the key clinical evidence really needs to be generated. And we're not saying that, you have to do this all the time. It depends on the technology. But particularly for the NHS, if you're looking to get your technologies adopted or used within the NHS, then you've got to really start thinking about the evaluation side of it early on, and not just at the stage where you're thinking, I've got my CE mark. So what I would advise you to do is think about, okay, if my technology is sitting in this space and really developed for this group of patients, yeah, who can help me develop the evidence? Even before I get CE mark, who can help potentially put together protocols looking at getting the evidence correct, so that when it comes to the adoption bit and CE mark bit, we've got some evidence in place. So the idea with this is we are looking at several stages in terms of the development pathway, but the evaluation bit, there's some key components within that. So things like assessing existing or potentially proposing new clinical care pathways. And again, this is key. Where does the technology fit into the clinical care pathway? Yeah, and then what are the comparators, in terms of the existing technologies in the market? And then qualifying analytical and clinical validity, because doing something in the lab is great, and you get tests and test results. Doing something in a clinical setting might be different, because there are various factors you need to take into account. And the other bit is clinical utility. Where exactly does what is the benefit of the technology when it comes to patient management? And then the last bit here is cost effectiveness. And again, the diagnostic evidence cooperatives here and the healthcare technology cooperatives are working with health economists to make sure that the evidence is generated to make it easier to put together a valid cost effectiveness argument. And thereby then, if you then take this forward, looking at potentially take these technologies in and applying to any of the NICE programs, whether it's the medical technology evaluation program or the diagnostic evidence, diagnostic assessment program, then you've got the evidence in place. So that just gives you a flavor. And the bottom really is what we see as the stakeholders at different stages. And again, it's a small writing, and the slides will be available, I'm sure. But the idea here is just to show you how broader you need to think in terms of who the stakeholders are. It's not just NHS people within the NHS, but there are commissioners, there are NHS horizon scanning people, you've got pathology, associations and so on. So there are different stakeholders. So how do you access all this infrastructure within NIHR? So the office where I work, we have I will say, a simple function, a simple remit, although it's not as simple as it might sound. It's a simple remit, is that if you have a technology, if you want to have access to the NIHR, you come to us. We will work with you to find who the key investigators are, who can help you either develop the technology or get the evidence for the technology. So it's all about clinical research. If you have a research question to answer, we are the place to come. Okay, so we act as a sort of a signposting. We do facilitate introductions between industry and investigators, establish collaborations. There are some standard agreements that we have in place now, which are signed and stuff. So the whole process is made easier. And then just looking at broadly in terms of some of the timelines, we have some metrics, internal metrics. We make sure that we are able to engage with the right investigators in a timely fashion. So if you as a company try to find these investigators and try and link up with them, it might take a bit of time. But because they're embedded within an NIHR and we have those links, it's easier for us to do it. So we can do that, and then probably from the time when we have initial information coming from companies to the point where we have sort of teleconferences or company meetings can be anything sort of between 14 to 21 days. So that's, I think that helps companies a lot. So I mentioned the clinical research network briefly. So I'm just going to say that if you have your technology CE marked, you've got initial data, but you want to run a trial within the NHS, where do you go? The clinical research network is the place to go. This is more sort of later phase if you want to do multi-center trials or even a single-center trial, but you know which patients you want. So they have a mechanism by which you can apply online. It's a simple portal. You fill out your information. You submit your protocol or synopsis. They have something called sort of feasibility, where they look at early feedback, site intelligence, and full service. It's not a CRO. Yeah, it's not a contract research organization. But what they do is a lot of the work that a CRO potentially tends to do, but they don't do the monitoring bit. They're just helping you, again, facilitate the right sites, to find the right sites to do your studies and so on. There are some commercial costing templates, again, available online. You can see exactly what the costings are for each of the studies and what's involved. This NIHR coordinated system for gaining NHS permissions, very important, because one of the questions that always gets asked is, oh yeah, but how about R&D and ethics and everything else? We now have a system in place where everything runs in parallel, rather than waiting for R&D approvals and then ethics approvals. We're trying to streamline the whole process, again, making it shorter. So again, this is done through our online systems. We have model agreements, the model clinical trial agreements, again, available online to have a look at. So the idea with this is these things are pre-signed. So if a company says, okay, fine, we agree to this, it's all done. It's done very quickly. So you don't have to wait months and months to get these agreements signed. And then study management. The clinical research network, because we have this huge infrastructure in place, they actually have nurses within NHS trusts who who make sure that patients are being recruited to studies on time, on target. Yeah. So these guys are on the ground. So as a company, you don't necessarily need to go to individual centers. You just have the one point of contact within the clinical research network, and then they will help you manage that process. So like I said, there's one portal. You submit your study through this portal, and after that, it's fairly straightforward. Probably for an SME, you're probably saying it's quite daunting. I don't have a lot of resources, but I assure you, if you want to do this, it's a lot easier than it sounds. And also, if you have questions, these guys have a team that will be able to help you and guide you through the process. Okay, so I think that's enough from me. All I'll say is that if you wanted to know more, if you want to know more, or you want access to the NIHR, please have a chat to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. That was very impressive, I must say. But so, how expensive is it for the small companies to come?
How expensive is it? How long is a piece of string? No. Well, the whole service, in terms of what we offer, is paid for by Department of Health. So we don't charge companies anything for our service. You can use us as many times as you like. It's fine. But in terms of obviously carrying out the research, that's a different matter. It depends on the study. It depends on what you want to do. But like I said, we work to certain standards, and there are costing templates that are available, so companies can quite easily have a look at those costing templates. But for the early phase research side of things, like I said, it all depends on what the company wants. And again, that's a negotiation that takes place not between us and the companies, but between the institution, investigators, and the companies. But I would probably say that it's probably not as expensive as you would think.
Okay, that sounds reassuring. So, questions from the audience? Jeppe, you have to push the button there, I think.
This one? Yeah. Okay. I'm Jeppe Magnusson. How are the clinicians incentivized to participate in this?
Okay, so for those that work within NIHR, they are linked to the biomedical research centers, biomedical research units. There is a remit, and they have to report every year in terms of what they do and how they interact with industry. So they get a huge amount of funding, and they have to account for that funding, and they have to make sure that they're hitting certain milestones and targets.
So this is part of their job description, yes, to participate in this?
Very much so. So
is that selected clinicians, or is
it's the ones that are linked to the biomedical research centers and units? Yes, there's a competition that's run every 4 or 5 years for these guys to get the money. It's not just handed out. So there's a significant amount of effort and goes in from the centers to make sure that they're actually putting the right clinicians forward, because they have to show a track record. The clinicians have to show a track record to be selected. They can't just be chosen at random. Yep.
Any more questions? Magnus?
So I think this sounds great. I wonder, what you described here as a process for medical devices, is there a similar path if you have a drug?
Yeah, yeah, very much so. Very similar. All the biomedical research centers, units, they work. A lot of this was set up and was utilized by the pharmaceutical industry. What we've done over the last couple of years is really try to focus on the medical devices side. So there is a huge amount of pharma work that goes on there. And again, the clinical research network, most of the work that they do is linked with the contract research organizations who use their services. About 65% of the work that goes into the clinical research network is pharmaceutical companies through clinical research organizations or contract research organizations.
Any more questions? I think you will stay here today, so if people want to ask you...
Yes, I'm here all day, so feel free.
Just approach him. Okay, we continue. We thank Nick again. Thank you. Hello. Thank Ravi.